Hello there. Welcome to the first part of the course, Introduction to Interpreting. The very first chapter will be about the fundamentals of interpretation. Before we get started, I would like to make an announcement. I understand that some of you might have some experience in interpreting already. I know some of you have no idea what interpreting is about. It does not matter. I'm conducting these lectures as if you do not know anything about interpreting, because this is an online class, meaning I don't get to see you, I don't get to know how much knowledge you already have, so I'm going to start from the very beginning so everybody can follow, but I will try my very best to not make it too boring. I still do want to give you a heads up that we will be talking about a lot of stuff later on. So if you ever feel lost, I highly recommend you go back and rewatch these videos on the fundamentals of interpretation. Here is the table of contents for our lesson 1. This is all provided in the syllabus, so if you haven't checked that out, please do. Well, let's get started right away. The very first topic. What is an interpreter? I really don't like throwing a dictionary definition here, so let me visually explain it for you. This is Mr. Kim's family. They're from Korea, South Korea. And they moved to the United States of America when the kids were young, and his family lived an immigrant's life in the US. Of course, time flies. The kids all moved out to different states, the wife passed away, and Mr. Kim is left alone. One day, Mr. Kim didn't feel so well. He had to go see a doctor at the hospital. And although it has been decades since Mr. Kim has been living in this country, Mr. Kim doesn't feel comfortable speaking in English, which is his second language, especially to describe his symptoms or past medical history to an English-speaking doctor. I mean, the doctor doesn't speak Korean, which is Mr. Kim's language, so they're stuck. That's when the interpreter comes in to help. So the English-speaking doctor and the Korean-speaking patient, Mr. Kim, can have a proper conversation. In fact, this is not the only situation. Especially with the help of a remote interpreting service, we can work as an interpreter using phone calls, video calls from home. We could be helping Mr. Kim talk with the customer service representatives from companies like we all know, like Amazon, Airbnb, TD Bank, Uber, or maybe a police officer or an operator from a 911 call. It could be for a trial with a judge or a lawyer. This is what interpreters do. We help others as a bilingual so that people can have proper communication without the language barrier. With the internet and technologies that make remote three-way or multi-way calls possible, there are more and more companies and organizations that are needing professional interpreters more than ever. Now, when I use this term interpreter, people often think of the term translator as well. So whenever I train someone to become an interpreter, I always start by asking this question. What is the difference between an interpreter and a translator? Well, ask yourself, is there a difference? If there is, do you know what the difference is? Of course there is difference, and I have learned that often this is not very clear to many people. Let me explain. Interpreting is about listening and speaking, whereas translating is about reading and writing or typing. To make it simple, we say interpreters speak the language and translators write the language. When you're working as an interpreter, you will hear something like this all the time. Hey translator, can you translate for us? Or a hello translator, I have a patient that needs your help with translating. Should we stop and educate these people by saying, excuse me, I'm not a translator, I'm an interpreter? And like every single time that happens, no, definitely not. In my opinion, it often feels unnecessary to explain this difference to others, and often it's just irrelevant and it does not affect my job. But I do think it is very important that we know the difference because we want to understand what exactly we are doing. Once again, this course is for interpreters because you will be listening and talking, not for translators who will be reading and writing. Speaking of interpreters, there are different types of interpreters as well. In a very broad sense, I guess I could say there are two major types of interpreters. Type 1 would be remote interpreters, meaning you are not actually present physically at the place where the conversation is happening. So often you are working from home, or maybe you have a designated office with a quiet environment. The other type would be on-site interpreters who will be actually at the site where the conversation is happening, interpreting face-to-face or interpreting in a booth specifically designated for interpreters. I will focus more on remote interpreting in this course, as many new interpreters will start off as a remote interpreter and take on on-site interpreting assignment when they feel more confident. But the basic idea or fundamentals I will cover in this course should really work the same way for both types. For remote interpreters, we have mainly over-the-phone interpreters, often abbreviated to OPIs, or the video remote interpreters, VRI in short. Although I believe OPI and VRI are most commonly used abbreviations, these acronyms may vary from companies to companies. I have heard people saying terms like telephonic interpreters or on-demand interpreters, but you definitely don't have to know all of these terms. Both OPI and VRI have its own pros and cons, but I will not be talking about them here just because we have so many other important things to talk about. If you are really curious about the differences between these two and want to know if you should pick one over the other, I am sure I will make a video about it and post it on my YouTube channel. One thing that I really hope happens, and I really don't think is far away, is maybe VRI actually becoming a virtual reality interpreter. I'm picturing this as interpreters being in a metaverse-like place, but you actually work from home just like OPIs and VRIs. I also think many people worry about AI replacing the interpreters at some point. Well, what do I think? I think it will happen sooner or later. And you might be thinking, well, why am I taking this class then? But don't worry. Ironically, I think that will only happen only if we have a lot more qualified interpreters than we have right now. I am sure I will make a video about that at some point, so if you are curious about what I think, well, stay tuned. Besides the terms like OPI or VRI, which we just talked about, there are many other terms that interpreters use in this industry. Let me go over some of the industry-specific jargon and explain some of the terminology that I will be using throughout the course. Let's say you are interpreting. You are interpreting for two people, namely person A and person B. This person A only speaks English, and this person B only speaks Korean. I'm saying Korean because that's my language, but since this is a language neutral course, just pretend like this is the language that you speak besides English. For some of you, it might be Spanish, or Vietnamese, or French. It does not matter, as long as you speak the language that person B speaks here. And obviously, I'm the interpreter who is able to speak both English and Korean. Simple enough, right? From now on, I am going to call this person A, the English-speaking person, a client. The main reason why we call this English speaker a client is because they are generally the ones that are paying the company that we work for. When you work as a remote interpreter, it is most likely you are working as a contractor for a company that provides interpreting services. Technically, you could be providing your interpreting services privately, but that will make these terms a little bit confusing. So to make this thing simple, let's just suppose we are interpreting for a company. We often call these companies a language service provider, namely LSP. LSP provides your interpreting services to our clients, which could be, for example, Airbnb. So, when a representative from Airbnb needs to have a conversation with the person who only speaks Korean, they will request a Korean interpreter to help with that conversation. That's when I, the interpreter, will get on the line. Then who is this person B? If you haven't figured it out already, this person B is a customer of Airbnb, right? Once again, person B doesn't speak English, but since they are an Airbnb customer, person A, the Airbnb representative, has to help them using our LSP's interpreting service line. Let's make it even more confusing and give this person B a name. From now on, we will call this person B an LEP. I think it is pretty standard that we say LEP, not LEP. What does this mean? It means limited English proficiency. We will actually talk about this more in detail later in our lecture, but here is a heads up for you. We will never use the term LEP on the call. To remind you, we are talking about interpreters' terminology and industry jargon. We are labeling person A and person B to make our conversation easier. We never address these people on the call saying something like, excuse me, your LEP said, no, never. When we really understand the relationship between the client and LEP, we can see why we name these person A and person B as client and LEP. Who is this client here? That is the interpreter's customer, right? Hence the name client. That's why we call them client. How about the LEP? LEP is our client's client. Indeed, we also don't generally say the word client on the call to refer to our client because in many cases, our client will refer the LEP as their clients. I know this can be really confusing, but let me try to make it simple here. In this course, when I say a client, that's person A. When I say LEP, that's person B. On real life calls, we will generally use the terms like representative or agent to call our client. And for our LEP, we can either say their name or a customer or any other terms that will be appropriate knowing your language and culture. For example, in Korean, I don't think it is very common for me to call people by their first name, especially when they are a lot older than I am. So instead, I simply say 선생님, which literally means a teacher in Korean. This is just a culturally appropriate term to call someone whom you have never met before and you are being respectful. Some languages might have a word like this, some might not. If you really can't find the right word, try to think about how these customer service representatives would call you, how they address you in your language. Now, let's say our client is speaking. What language will our client speak? I hope that is not too hard to guess. It's got to be English, right? Our client is the English speaker here. Let's say this is what our client says. Hello, Mr. Kim. May I have your date of birth, please? Here, obviously, Mr. Kim is not the interpreter. It is the Korean-speaking LEP. So our client just spoke in English to the interpreter so that the interpreter can relay the question to the Korean-speaking LEP in Korean. What was provided to the interpreter, we will call it an utterance. The utterance is basically what is given to the interpreter. In this case, it is the client that is providing the utterance to the interpreter. Now the interpreter will interpret what the client has said. 김 선생님 안녕하세요. 본인의 생년월일을 말씀해 주시겠습니까? Now, if you're not a Korean-speaking person, you might not understand what I just said. To make this course a language-neutral course, meaning it's not just for people who speak English and Korean, from now on, I am going to write the interpretation in English only, but I will have them in square brackets. So that is why you will see these square brackets from now on. Any sentences inside of the square brackets are what is to be said in a language other than English. In my case, Korean. In your case, is probably another language. After hearing the utterance from our client, the interpreter interpreted the utterance and spoke to the LEP, right? We are going to call this a rendition. What interpreter says or provides after the utterance is the rendition, which is essentially what we call an interpretation. So we just learned two terms, utterance, rendition. I hope it's not too confusing. Now let's look at the other way around. The LEP is speaking in Korean to the interpreter. The LEP says, my date of birth is January 24th, 1960. But obviously they would say this in Korean in real life, but for this course, I'm writing them in English with the square brackets. So what do we call this again? This is the utterance. What is being provided to the interpreter is the utterance. Then what do we do as an interpreter once we receive the utterance? We interpret and say, my date of birth is January 24th, 1960. One thing to note, you see how the interpreter says my date of birth, not his or Mr. Kim's date of birth? It is important that we stay in first person speech. We will talk about this later again, but I wanted to briefly mention it here. So since the utterance is given, what is coming next? It's the rendition. I really hope this is not too difficult. Let me give you a summary. Utterance. The utterance is what is given to the interpreter. The rendition or interpretation is given by the interpreter. We provide these renditions to either our client or LEP. If everything is good, let's move on. Going back to our client and LEP again. Here the client is going to provide an utterance to us. What is the language of the utterance? Yes, it is English, right? Our client only speaks English. How about for the rendition? That would be Korean for me or whatever language you speak. I'm going to name these languages that are used for utterances and renditions. In this case, we call the English language a source language. A source language is the language of the utterance. For the rendition, we say it is a target language. A target language is the language of the rendition. Note that this actually changes depending on who is providing the utterance and to whom you are providing your rendition. Now the LEP is talking and the interpreter is interpreting it to the client, then we will have the opposite of what we just had. Now the source language is Korean and the target language is English. Once again, I hope this isn't too confusing because from now on, I will be using these terms quite often to specify what is being said and what is being heard. So let me summarize this as well. A source language is the language of the utterance. A target language is the language of the rendition. Here is the same example I showed you just now. The client spoke first and the interpreter interpreted to the LEP. The source language is English and the target language is Korean. Basically, the interpreter is going from English to Korean or whatever language that you speak. How about the other way around? We will have an utterance that is in Korean, so our source language is in Korean, and the target language will be English. We just learned a bunch of new terminology that all interpreters must know, in my opinion. There will be a lot more terms that we will learn as we go, but I hope this is all crystal clear to everyone so far. If it is not, please feel free to go back to the beginning of the video and watch it again, because this is actually quite important for the rest of the course. Let's talk about the modes of interpreting. When I say modes of interpreting, this is different from the types of interpreting that I mentioned before, like an OPI or VRI. Modes of interpreting is basically how the interpreting is done. There are many different ways of doing the interpretation, so let's go over them quickly. First up is consecutive interpreting. As the name suggests, consecutive interpreting is when the interpreting is done in turns. Like in the example that I was giving you earlier, your client speaks, you speak, LEP speaks, you speak again, client speaks again. So everyone is taking a turn to speak. This is the most common form of interpreting and also the most accurate form of interpreting. 99% of the interpreting that I will be talking about in my videos will be done as a consecutive interpreting. It is used when we interpret remotely as an OPI or a VRI. Many in-person interpreting in a medical setting will all happen consecutively. Another form of interpreting that probably many people think what all interpreters do is the simultaneous interpreting. Simultaneous interpreting is basically interpreting at the same time or with a very short delay as you are listening to what needs to be said. Now, another way of understanding the difference between these two modes of interpreting is to see when the utterance and rendition are happening. You see, consecutive interpreting, utterance first and then rendition. Simultaneous, we have utterance and rendition happening at the same time, or rendition after utterance with a very short delay. Simultaneous interpreting is commonly used in a conference or a seminar where one speaker is talking to a group of people or a big audience. It is definitely more time efficient, but it is generally less accurate than consecutive interpreting. Next is side translation. What is a side translation? I thought we said translation and interpretation were two different things. Some people call it a side interpretation too, but more commonly people call it side translation. This is when the interpreter is reading a document in the source language and provides an oral interpretation in the target language. So one example would be a nurse asking you to side translate instruction form for MRI exam to a patient who doesn't know how to read in English. So as you as an interpreter would read the form that is in English and read it out in the target language that the LEP understands. I am not going to cover any site translation in this lecture, but for sure there will be times you might have to do this if you decide to take on-site interpreting jobs. It is far less common with remote interpreting. There is also the sign language interpreting, which is something we will not talk about in this course. Whispered or chuchotage interpreting is basically a simultaneous interpreting where you are whispering your rendition to one party. This generally happens in a small conversation or a speech where you do not want to interrupt the speaker which you're interpreting. There are more interpreting modes, but I really don't think this is something you need to memorize or anything. I just wanted to briefly cover this so you know there are different modes of interpreting. That's all. Now, let's move on to the next part that is actually far more important than this. See you there.